Allison Miller lay in bed in her cabin on her way back to Florida from the Caribbean island. The ship had just passed through the end of a tropical depression that was stronger than forecasters had predicted. Many of the guests on board were suffering from seasickness, and many, like Allison, were now lying in bed recovering from nausea as the sea was calm again. Too weak to stand, she could only smile as she recalled the life-changing events of the cruise. Her sister, Melissa James, lay on her single bed in their shared cabin, also recovering from the storm. Allison was a 32-year-old housewife and lead Java programmer working remotely. She and her husband picked up and dropped off their 10-year-old elementary school student on school days. For beautiful women, her husband, George Miller, 34, was one of many who considered Allison a 10 back in college, where they met in their third year. He was the envy of their friends because after 11 years, she was still a 10 to most men who met her. But Allison, a perpetual loner and extreme introvert, had a deep, dark longing for something she couldn't describe. At first, she blamed her sad feelings on the fact that she no longer had to talk to her work colleagues, since her office was now only at home and she did not communicate with anyone except her programmers, who lived all over the country. Allison no longer followed what was happening in the world, for example. The recluse never voted. In fact, she didn't use social media or watch mainstream news or programs. Always on guard not to waste a minute of her time, Allison sometimes watched classic films. Her problem was that not only did she spend her days alone, but she also did not feel loved or appreciated by her husband. He always seemed to be immersed in his activities in the man cave. Her constant thought was, something is missing, and someone, and I, a smart woman, can solve this problem. The programmer worked out intensely in their home gym, partly to break up the monotony of working on code, and enjoyed soft music, using the family's audiophile equipment. Sometimes her muscles would ache from sitting in one position for too long. When this happened, she would lay her head down on her cluttered desk and remind herself, it's a 2-year contract and I'm making more money now than I've ever made before, so just hang in there, old girl. After resting and walking around the room, she either went back to working hard at the keyboard or talking to her team's programmers for 14 hours on many days. Part of Allison longed for company, but she didn't care about the few who were available and wanted to talk to her. God, what a boring person. Her reward was that once a week she went to a dance studio party alone, where they really wanted her as a dance partner simply because she was a beautiful woman. She also followed a strong leader on the dance floor. Everyone knew that she was married and that her husband tacitly supported her social dances, but mostly chose not to go to dances with her himself. Melissa James, Allison's sister, was 2 years younger, but had allowed her body to become chubby, and it was noticeable as her BMI was 4 points higher than Allison's, whose BMI was proudly 23. Melissa never had been training, so her once hard muscles were now soft even though she was a trained silver-level dancer. A mother of 2, she was a stay-at-home mom, while her husband, Harry James, had a successful home remodeling job in bathrooms and kitchens. He was well known and successful as word of mouth worked well for Harry. The sisters' 2 husbands, Harry and George, were close friends and both were fans of hunting and fishing, although both families lived in a small town west of Boston. They rarely engaged in such types of recreation, so they saved their money for a once-in-a-lifetime big-game hunting trip in the wilds of northern British Columbia. Since the men would be in the woods for 8 days, Allison and Melissa decided to place their 3 children in the care of their parents and go on a 10-day dance cruise. Having booked it online with the foursome's full consent, the ladies were planning to fly to Fort Lauderdale for a cruise to the Western Caribbean. This plan was a win-win for all 4 adults and 3 children. Once the plans were finalized, there was excitement in both houses. After the cruise group woke up on the day of the trip, the children were taken to the 2 sisters' mother, and the foursome continued to long-term parking at the Logan Express. Later, George's last words to the 2 women before he and Harry got off the bus in another terminal were, "Enjoy your dance cruise, but don't be tempted by a couple of hot guys on the dance floor." Plump Melissa replied, "Don't worry, George. I'll be the official escort, and I'll smash the face of any man who tries to touch your wife on the dance floor." The four laughed. Melissa's husband, Harry James, told his wife, "Darling, you are a silver-level dancer, and men will come out of all corners wanting to dance with you, and maybe more, because you know what men are like. That's why I'm worried, because you'll be at the mercy of all the wolves on board, who are advanced dancers. So if you accompany, who will accompany you?" Allison raised her hand and said, "I will, because I look like a woman with baggage, and wolves are not interested in a woman with a mortgage and a child." George stepped up and said, "Thank you, Melissa. I am now confident that you and Allison are in each other's good hands." Turning to his wife, he continued, "Kiss me goodbye before the bus reaches your terminal. Allison, I love you very much, so come back to us soon." After both couples said a warm goodbye, Melissa said, "Have a good hunt, guys, and be careful not to shoot each other or anyone else with your high-powered guns." Later, on the first evening at sea, the two ladies dressed in their most stylish and beautiful dresses and went from their cabin to the ship's ballroom. When they entered, an 8-string orchestra and vocalist were performing a Sinatra-style song, "Come Fly With Me." The ladies sat down and watched some advanced dancers perform the international foxtrot on the dance floor. Melissa said excitedly, "We hit the jackpot, Ollie, old friend. There are many advanced dancers here. Hooray." After the waiter brought their cocktails, the ship's two dance hosts invited the sisters to dance. Melissa noticed the name of one of them on the badge and told him her name. "Johnny, how long have you been dancing?" 15. "Okay, let's dance." Johnny Williamson learned something new about competition dancers from Melissa, even after 15 years of training dancers to prepare for such competitions. After 2 songs, he walked her back to their table and said, "Thank you, Melissa. You are professional. What a pleasure. Most of the unmarried guests I'm with I dance, they can only sway, so I have to work hard to be charming and friendly. Oh, what a pleasure it is to dance with you when it is not so. But according to the ship's rules, I can't ask you out again until I've danced with 3 other women. But can I ask you out later?" The plump housewife replied, "Oh, please invite me. My dear husband is not a dancer, but he allows me to go to the studio and practice with students, so dancing with a professional makes the whole trip worth it for me." After she showed off her dance, 2 male guests raced to their table to ask Melissa and Allison to dance. Allison's next partner was another paid employee of the ship, whose job was to dance and chat cheerfully with the unmarried female guests. This one was devilishly handsome, tall, muscular, and a skilled dancer, perhaps 10 years older than her. Mark Morley, as his badge said, was relaxed, and their conversation was light and witty. He skillfully guided the mother of one through easy dance figures, keeping her from pressing against his body in the slow dances. She told him, "Now I understand why my sister and I came on this cruise. My husband doesn't like to dance, but I love it. You, on the contrary, are an experienced professional. I love the way you lead me around the dance floor. It makes me feel like a pro. My sister and I will dance here every night. Please invite me again whenever you can." The next dance, Allison and Morley were talking easily and friendly at first, but then Allison began to relax and enjoy the moment in the presence of this dance leader. She thought to herself, "His eyes captured my attention. He should be very smart, but he chose to be a dance host." The next dance, when they continued to talk, was an American tango. Mark always danced with single women who flocked to dance with him, keeping their distance, especially in tango. Maintaining the atmosphere of the ballroom was his first priority. After all, he was a company man to the core. Mark Morley was Portuguese and grew up in extreme poverty with a single mother because his English father married and then abandoned his mother. The opportunity to apply and his acceptance by a cruise line as a teenager became his pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. He became a chef's assistant on a ship and then tried out as a dance MC at an evening job and was chosen. Now he sends his mother money every month thanks to the increased salary. When it comes to dancing, his forte was muscle memory and elegant movements. However, there were tense evenings. For example, in one dance move, Some women tried to press their upper thighs against their private parts, mostly in tango. Mark always stopped the lady guest from doing this because management could fire him and throw him overboard at the next stop if the incident was noticed or even reported by a jealous colleague. After the dance host asked 3 more women to dance, he returned to his beloved, Allison, and asked her again. However, this time it was tango again, and he couldn't hold her back politely. He felt her leg move and press against his seat in one of the movements. Always an embarrassing moment when this happened, he stopped the dance, stepped back, and said, "I love my job, Allison, so let's just talk while we dance, okay?" She replied, "Sorry I got carried away. You're right, let's just talk." So for 2 more songs, Allison relaxed even more as they focused on talking more than dancing. The reality was that Mark listened while Allison talked about her empty feelings. His curt answers impressed her so much that she didn't even want to dance with the other 2 men who asked her later when Mark was unavailable. At the last dance of the next evening, the MC explained the company rules again, and then changed the subject and said, "Today I am especially pleased." Allison asked, "What's special today, Mark?" He replied, "After we land in Aruba in 2 days, I will leave the ship. I decided not to return to my native Portugal for my 30-day annual vacation and rented a furnished apartment near the beach in Aruba. After that, I will fly to another ship. In short, I am exhausted from working 7 days a week and 18 hours a day. I told you that by day I work with a salad chef, and by night I dance with single ladies to earn money, but they give me food and accommodation and world travel as part of my package. So on holiday, I'll be spending time topless and sometimes on nude beaches with friends I've met over the years for the next 30 days. I'm sure you'll envy me." She replied, "Yes, I'm jealous. The ship will only be docked from 5:30 a.m. for the next 12 hours, so I will only see some of the tourist attractions. Mark, I am glad that our paths crossed, and it will be impossible for you to disappear from my memory after our deep conversations." Later, returning to their cabin, both ladies fell into their beds from exhaustion. Melissa said, "Hey sister, we hit the jackpot. There's a whole dance studio on board from New Jersey, and one of their former regional champions is among them, and I jived a few times, and we fit each other like a glove." Allison said, "Well, I really liked a dance host called Mark Morley, and I saw him dance with you once. What do you think of him?" Her sister replied, "He's the best dancer on this ship, but he said it was company policy that he couldn't dance with me anymore. I have to make circles with all the single ladies who dance here. But Allison, you managed to dance with him several times, right?" "Yes, several times, and I got to know him a little better because we had deep conversations about ourselves." After describing his past, Allison continued, "He's leaving the ship for a 30-day annual leave when we dock in Aruba, so maybe someone else interesting will ask me to dance later." The plump sister replied, "Lucky guy. And just think about those happy women who will cross paths with him. These dance hosts are celibates when it comes to the female guests in their arms, so he'll probably be getting into bed with some of the stunning women vacationing here. But if I were young and stupid and still pretty, I might have a crush on that Mark Morley guy, but I don't really fit his criteria until I lose weight and start going to the gym regularly." After the 2 ladies turned off the lights, chubby Melissa slept soundly, breathing through her mouth for 5 minutes. Allison couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, thinking of Mark Morley. She continued to imagine the 2 of them making love on a blanket by the ocean. She stopped thinking about him and thought, "Pull yourself together, Allison. You have too much at stake to pursue him." The next evening, the sisters were again in the ballroom. The former champion from New Jersey seemed to be waiting for Melissa to arrive. One of the dance hosts asked Allison to dance, and then Mark Morley came up again. Finding himself in his arms, dancing a slow waltz, the host smiled deeply and sadly and said, "Thank you for coming today so we can say goodbye properly, Allison. There will be no time to talk after we dock in the morning, so we need to say goodbye tonight." She blurted out, "Mark, I dreamed that you and I made passionate love on a blanket on the beach in Aruba. I can only say, oh, what could have been. But my hard-working husband and my 10-year-old son, whom I love very much, will be glad that this only happened in my dreams." Mark looked at her carefully, wondering what to say, if at all, and replied, "I'm just glad I found someone with a mind like yours, who I can talk to and who keeps me on my toes about things." His erudition in so many areas. Believe me, this is a pleasure for dance leaders around the world. I hope, dear Allison, that you and your husband find each other again. She looked at the dance leader, holding back many things she wanted to say, but finally smiled and apologized. She then went to her cabin without saying any of the things that were bubbling in her head. The next morning, as the crowd eager to disembark at Aruba thinned, Allison noticed that Melissa had left early for her 9-hour tour of the island. After breakfast, Allison headed to the ramp to stroll around and look at the shop windows near the pier. The programmer spotted her favorite dance presenter, Mark Morley, with 2 suitcases in his hands in the employee exit queue, which was located next to her queue. Apparently, he was one of many waiting to leave the ship. He didn't recognize Mrs. Miller away from the dance floor as Allison was wearing shorts and a top for maximum tan. In fact, he couldn't remember a single woman who had been in his arms, dressed and made up the night before. After the ship's security guard checked her out, she looked back and noticed Mark had left the line to fill out paperwork. She walked further down the ramp and entered the immigration area. After checking the documents, her heart suddenly began to beat wildly, and she said to herself, "I will wait for this handsome man here." The housewife saw Mark go through immigration and approached him. She said, "Hi, Mark Morley. You look like a man who needs someone to carry one of your suitcases. I lift 80 pounds overhead at the gym, so I'm quite strong. Can—" Mark's shock after realizing who it was turned into a wide smile. He said, laughing, "Well, I know from personal experience that you have a strong body, especially your arms, and this proposal is my most pleasant surprise this year. So hello, Allison. My God, you look even better in shorts than in a cocktail dress. But we can't talk here." She looked offended and said, "Oh? Some colleagues may recognize you as one of the single ladies I danced with on board. If you go to the Paradise Bar at the end of the next street called Foster," he pointed to a map on the wall, "and wait half an hour, you can buy me a drink, and we can talk as long as we want. Fine?" "Fine." 30 minutes later, Paradise Bar on Foster. "See you." She watched as Mark got into a taxi and drove away with 2 suitcases. Then Allison went shopping, looking at the boutique windows, until she ended up in front of the bar 10 minutes early. She walked into the nearly empty bar and ordered a non-alcoholic beer while she waited. 15 minutes later, Mark burst into the bar and said breathlessly, "Sorry for the delay, but I couldn't find my landlord first to get the keys to the apartment. But now everything is settled." After he ordered a beer, they talked for about 15 minutes. As expected, both were completely relaxed in each other's company again. When Mark offered to buy a second circle, Allison gently touched his forearm and calmed her racing heart by saying, "No. Would you like to show me your temporary housing?" He looked at her carefully and said, "Are you sure we want to do this, Allison?" She replied, "No, but you could talk me into anything, especially if you held me in your arms again." "Allison, my ego is inflated. If you knew how many cabin numbers many unfortunate, fat, and confused ladies whispered to me, you would understand what a compliment you gave me. So you are a beautiful and erudite woman, whose company I enjoy. But no, it is not me who can fill that void that you told me about earlier. Most modern people carefully hide this feeling from their peers and often from themselves. And the difference is that you are smart enough to understand that casual sex with a man will not solve your problem. I want the person I care about to be purposeful, prosperous, and proud. Casual sex won't lead to that. Besides, if you and I did it, we'd both lose a friend and just become 2 empty shells who passed by in the night. Both you and I can do better than this, can't we?" She had a pained and embarrassed expression on her face and said, "You're right, Mark, by all logic. But what can I do to feel better? Like, what are you doing? Well, everyone must find their own unique key to this secret. But dear Allison, in my opinion, you have to be on top of your career, plus you have to be completely in love with your significant other or spouse on both sides. When both love each other as if... Mark's phone rang, and he looked at the display and said, "Sorry, Allison, I need to answer. Hello, Jimmy." He listened for a minute and said, "I'm at the Paradise Bar on Foster, about 2 blocks from here. One of my dance partners and I are talking. Come." He continued talking to Allison after he ended the call and said, "Where we left off. Ah, yes, I guess that's what life is. Then the emptiness disappears like magic." At this point, Mark had her full attention, and she said, "Well, to translate what you said to my case, I'm a well-paid lead programmer, and I have 3 programmers who report to me, and I love my job. By process of elimination, then you are saying that my personal life with my husband needs work, right? This is what it looks like, Allison. Let's take dancing, for example. All your conversations with him on this topic are such that you never attracted his attention. You have to make him focus on you by repeating what you just told me about feeling empty. Since you are vital to your husband, you will attract his attention when he understands this. Then he will become flexible about attending dance parties, for example, because he will want to, and will not just drag himself to the dance floor as he does now. You will understand that he loves hunting and fishing, and you will encourage and intelligently support him in this. And then there will be countless other things that the two of you will do, and you will both become so attached to each other that casual sex with others will become impossible." Allison was stunned by what she had just heard, and goosebumps ran through her body as relaxation filled her psyche. She looked at Mark carefully, not knowing what to say. At that moment, the door opened and another man entered with 2 suitcases. As he approached them, Mark stood up, and the 2 men hugged and kissed on the lips as if they were married. "Jimmy, I have a new very close friend, and we have danced together many times. Meet Allison, a housewife whose goal is to improve her dancing and love life with her husband when she returns home. Allison, meet Jimmy. Jimmy and I got married in a small ceremony about a year ago on a beautiful beach in St. Martin. He is an engine maintenance technician on our ship, just finished work, and we will enjoy our 30-day vacation together." Jimmy shook the stunned housewife's hand and said, "Of course, any of Mark's girlfriends," and so on. "Nice to meet you, Allison. You must be special, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting in this bar talking to Mark for reasons obvious to you." Allison said, "I'm amazed, Jimmy, because I tried to attract your partner sexually, and he kept turning me down. Imagine my shattered self-image, because men often pursue me, trying to seduce me, although I ignore them. And then I pursued him myself and was refused. I now understand and regain my confidence that I am still a vibrant and sexy woman that my husband will love again. Thank you, Mark." The 3 burst into laughter, and each ordered 1 more. Jimmy later asked, "Did Mark tell you he was a Blackpool finalist in the smooth category when he was a young, competitive ballroom dancer?" She replied, "No, but I was asking how someone who dances like a professional can work as a paid dance host." Mark chimed in and said, "Well, I like to dance after I make salads, and I stay fit by dancing every night. And life rewards me, thanks to Jimmy." Allison replied, "That explains why you are the best dancer on the ship. Congratulations." Allison stood up and said, "Well, apparently there is a crowd, so I'll go back to the ship and wait for my sister to return from her island excursion. Mark, you have my email address. Promise that you will write from time to time." The dancer put his arm around her neck, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "Yes, and thank you for the compliment." Returning to the ship, Allison went over the events of the day in her head. She felt embarrassed at first and then said, "No, I shouldn't be embarrassed. In fact, I should feel very lucky. Now I just want to hug my husband again after the ship visits 2 more islands along the route." Then a dark thought struck her, and she said to herself, "You are a bitch, because if Mark was like the men you know, you would have cheated on your husband for the first time. and then you would have tried to live with it for a long time. She then retorted, "No, you're not a bitch, because you're just an introvert, attractive to men in seduction mode. You were just confused, like all your peers, but nothing more. And I was luckier than most." Later, in her cabin, the door opened and her sister Melissa came in, out of breath, and said, "I just took a tour of the entire island. We drove past Topless and the beach, we had a not very good lunch, and I made a friend who is a housewife. Her husband remained on board to take care of the children. Hopefully we can repeat this cruise in a year, and this time insist that Harry and George come with us. What do you think?" "Maybe. I was just walking around and window shopping in the nearby tourist area, then had some drinks and lunch at the bar and grill. I also met a friend and we drank and talked all day. Then I returned to the ship." Melissa said, "Well, we have 2 more islands to visit and then back to Fort Lauderdale and home. Damn it, I miss Harry because a few men touched me on the dance floor last night and I loved it. I sure as hell hope the game he eats gives him enough strength to stay in bed with me all day when we're back together without kids. Ha ha." Allison said, "You know, sister, this cruise has given me a new perspective on my marriage to George. I'm cutting back on my work hours and will be doing things together that we previously only did occasionally, like taking dance lessons. Oh, Ollie, you know you're going to have to drag George onto the dance floor, and he's not even trying to remember the new shapes." "Yes, but it's in the past tense. I have a new psychic sauce that I'll be using on George. This cruise taught me how to recapture our fiery romance. Wait and see." Back in the present, when the cruise director announced the ship's arrival in Florida the next morning and gave luggage and disembarkation instructions, Allison and Melissa were nearly exhausted from seasickness, but healthy and excited to be home the next day. Melissa said, "If I know Harry, he'll be so excited after meeting us at Logan Express that he'll want to do it even before we pick up the kids." Allison said, "Well, George is very horny after a couple of days without sex, and being apart for 10 days is sure to put him over the edge." After the Logan Express bus dropped them off where their husbands were waiting, the 2 couples were joyfully reunited. Melissa talked excitedly, almost non-stop, about the dances and excursions they had taken on shore as the ship docked at the islands along the cruise route. It was unlikely that Allison, sitting in the back seat and holding the hand of George, who was sitting next to her, was listening to Melissa chatting about the cruise. She noticed that her husband was excited and thought, "My man is so excited that he will want to take me to bed as soon as we enter the house, but I have to tell him about the changes that have happened in me. My mother still has the kids, and it's now or never that you have to talk to George directly, Allison." When they entered the house, her husband began persistently pushing her up the stairs to the bedroom. She stopped him at the foot of the stairs and said, "George, we need to talk." Since these are globally the most terrible words for any husband, his face became as if a jug of ice water had been poured on him. Lines of anxiety became clearly visible on him. He said, "Okay, if it can't wait, would you like to sit at the kitchen table and I'll bring you a beer?" After they started sipping their beers, Allison said, "First, we need to make some changes. I need to stop berating you for your late-night fishing trips and not getting angry when you stay late at a party to play darts with your friends." He said excitedly, "Really? Oh, thank you, honey. What fantastic news." He grabbed her hands and started kissing them, and then stopped. Continuing, George asked, "Wait, what led to this?" Allison said, "George, you and I were discussing my recurring bouts of sadness and emptiness. I mistakenly concluded that these feelings were tormenting me because I spent so much time working alone. While looking for a solution, I met a man who impressed me so much that I unsuccessfully tried to persuade him to make love to me." George looked at her in bewilderment and asked, "What do you mean, unsuccessfully? Because it couldn't happen to any man I know." "Well, my attempt to seduce him happened, and he refused to invite me into his bed." Her husband jumped to his feet and began to pace around the room. For the first time in his life, he felt the pain of a blow to a man's ego. His mouth went dry, and he felt a strong blow to his stomach. His breathing became ragged, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. Allison continued, I chose to tell you about this when I could have kept silent about my adventure, as all the women I know would have done, for one reason. I love you quietly and desperately, George, and I try my best to respect your desire to spend time with friends. But I want you to help me by doing some things together. For example, I want to go bowling the next time Priscilla and Jerry invite us, and I want you to go to group dance class with me and for us to make friends with the other couples in our dance class. George said, Allison, you're asking me to change who I am. Dear husband, our marriage is the most important thing to me. Life is about doing what's important. Remember your mom's advice that there is always time and motivation to do what's important. Make us important, George. In fact, make us the most important thing in your life, except maybe your career. George, who was still standing and pacing around the room, now sweating profusely, said, Well, I need time to process what you told me and make these changes. Shall we go for a walk, darling? While walking, she told him about all the frustrations and emptiness she felt being home alone all day long. She then said, I'm tired of feeling empty, George, and the solution is for us to do more things together. But the most important thing is that we want to do things together. A few blocks later, they came across a beautiful yard with flowers and shrubs and mulched beds that were free of weeds. The couple watched as husband and wife owners worked together to weed, prune, and fertilize their front garden. George and Allison stopped to watch, holding each other's hands, but said nothing. Both their eyes turned red from pent-up tears of happiness. Allison saw that her husband understood what she had been trying to convey to him for years. He thought, I have to do this to save our marriage, because next time she might cheat. George then said, Allison, I received your message loud and clear. Now you will have a husband. Thank you for the opportunity to change our ways. She looked at him, squeezed his hand, smiled, and said, Let's hurry home. The last time you held me in your arms was 12 days ago. And George, welcome to our world. After a year of exchanging infrequent emails with Mark Morley, a paid dance host, Allison received an email that included docking and sailing dates and times at the port of Boston. It said, in part, Jimmy and I are on shore leave this day and have heard that the Italian restaurants in the historic district rival the Italian restaurants. Is there any chance that you and your husband could meet us at the ship and show us around the city in exchange for lunch at our expense? On the day Mark Morley's ship docked at the Boston cruise port, the four sat at a small restaurant table near a statue of Paul Revere, hero of the 1776 Revolution, on his horse. Mark and Allison chatted happily as they were happy to see each other again. Mark's husband, Jimmy, and her husband, George, were mostly silent at first, simply watching the two friends enjoy the moment. George never stopped to wonder if his wife had a moment with that dance host where the hormones took over. But now George tried to come home early on dance nights because he began to enjoy it after classes and meeting the new friends they had made. In fact, he became a better dancer, and the more he studied, the more he wanted to dance. One day, while the four were discussing dancing, George asked Morley, Mark, how do you do a knee-light heel turn in a waltz? The dance leader smiled and stood up from the table and said, Watch carefully how I lead this element so that my knees are not strained. The secret is to keep all the weight on the back of the heel so that the minimum surface touches the floor. After he sat down again, he continued, Now try it for yourself, George. Having mastered the technique, George found a new friend. Jimmy, watching his husband and Allison interact, relaxed for the first time. He, too, was worried that his husband might go to bed with a housewife. But he calmed down and said to himself, Sex requires desire and opportunity, and these two had neither. They ordered a second bottle of wine, and the engine maintenance technician and electrician talked about the physics of propelling a giant ocean liner over long distances. The dance presenter and programmer discussed George and Allison's dance experiences over the past year. She quietly whispered to Mark, We wouldn't be enjoying this delicious Italian dinner if you and I hadn't become friends. He replied, "You're right, Allison. I think you and George are in love again. This is amazing news." Finally, it was time to take a taxi back to the ship, and the bill arrived. George grabbed him and said, "This is my party. Thank you both for hosting this lunch with us. It's very nice to meet someone who helped Allison and me gain a new perspective on life." At the cruise terminal, both guests shook hands with George. Allison hugged the dance host and kissed him on the cheek. "Please stay in touch, Mark. Thank you very much for being my friend." Here's a brief retelling of the story.